I am back. Resist 35 Profiles of Ordinary People Who Rose Up Against Tyranny and Injustice by Veronica Chambers. And today we are discussing the Dalai Lama. He said, "If you think you're too small to make a difference, try sleeping with a mosquito." He was only 4 years old when he was officially named His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, the spiritual leader of the Tibetan people. He'd been identified at the age of 2 as the reincarnation of his predecessor, the 13th Dalai Lama. In the Tibetan tradition, the Dalai Lamas are the living embodiments of the Bodhisattva, a being of tremendous compassion. Once he was chosen to be the next Dalai Lama, he was taught to put others first, to open his mind and his heart to everyone he encountered. He began training to lead his people when he was 6 years old. As a child, he sometimes resented not being able to have the same kind of carefree fun that other kids did. He spent most of his time in a monastery, a religious community. He had playmates, but most of them were adults. When asked if he had ever thought about being a normal person instead of the Dalai Lama, he replied, "Yes, at a young age. Sometimes I felt, oh, this is a burden. I wish I was an unknown Tibetan. Then I'd have more freedom. But then later I realized that my position was something useful to others." He spent a lot of his days in quiet, reading and meditating, and he still does. He believes that in the quiet, people find peace, and that inner peace is something we should all strive for. He said, if every 8-year-old is taught meditation, we will eliminate violence from the world within 1 generation. When he was just 15 years old, he was named the leader of his country. Can you imagine being a teenager and being in charge of a country of 6 million people? When he was 24, he took exams at 3 academically focused monasteries, Drepung, Sera, and Ganden. One morning he was examined by 30 scholars on logic. In the afternoon, he debated with 15 scholars on the subject of moderation known as the middle path. And in the evening, 35 scholars tested his knowledge of the canon of monastic discipline and the study of metaphysics. He passed his exams with full honors and received a doctorate of Buddhist philosophy when he was just 25 years old. He was still in the midst of his studies when Tibet was invaded by China. In 1954, he traveled to China to meet In 1954, he traveled to China to meet with Mao Zedong and other Chinese leaders. He hoped for a peaceful reconciliation, but the Chinese were determined to incorporate Tibet as part of their nation. In 1959, he was forced into exile. The Dalai Lama spent many years fighting for the independence of his country. He made multiple appeals to the United Nations for Tibetan democracy and independence, but the Chinese occupation continued and still continues today. Being a leader in exile for most of his life has made him realize how deeply people are connected, how borders are illusory. Since he cannot go home to Tibet, he brought Tibet to the world. In his speeches, he reminds the world that we have a better chance of achieving a peaceful world if we embrace the Tibetan idea of universal responsibility. He urges people to pay less attention to nations and borders and more to a commitment to be helpful and to do right in whatever small way we can. He devotes himself to the launching of institutions, educational, cultural, and religious, that preserve Tibetan identity and heritage all over the world. In this way, not through war or violence, the Dalai Lama resists. Despite the military force occupying his country, he keeps Tibet alive. Nearly 80,000 refugees followed the Dalai Lama into exile. He created a school to teach them the language, history, and culture of their country. He founded the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives, which houses more than 100,000 manuscripts and documents about Tibetan history, politics, and life. He gives speeches, and what he begins to talk about is not politics, but kindness. This, he says, is his religion. He could have made his time in exile one of darkness and silence. It has been more than 50 years since he has been allowed to visit his home country of Tibet. But rather than focus on all of that, rather than focus on all that he and his people have lost, he has chosen to share his wisdom, often tinged with humor, with the world. He often shares a popular Tibetan saying, and it goes like this: wherever you have friends, that's your country. And wherever you receive love, that's your home. At the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century, when wars reigned and people suffered, he has become a symbol of hope and optimism for the world. It isn't that he never gets angry. When asked if he ever felt rage, he once said, "Oh, yes, of course, I'm a human being." Generally speaking, if a human being never shows anger, then I think something's wrong. He's not right in the brain. And then he laughs. When asked about how he stayed hopeful in the face of great tragedy, he said, quote, "I always look at any event from a wider angle. There's always some problem, some killing, some murder, or terrorist act, or scandal everywhere, every day. But if you think the whole world is like that, you're wrong. Out of 6 billion humans, the troublemakers are just a handful." He believes that we are more alike than not. He reminds us that good people far outnumber those who commit acts of cruelty and injustice. He urges us to imagine the other person's point of view, to remember that we are more connected than we might imagine. He wants us to know that even when we don't always understand each other, it helps to remember that deep down, we all want happiness, and that the world is a better place when we look upon other people's suffering as a burden we must share. It all comes down to sharing, he believes. Share the suffering, share the joy, and change the world. He says, the people who want to do good are the real majority. Troublemakers make up just a handful of all the people in the world. And I think that's a really important lesson to think about, especially in today's world, and the kind of crazy that we've seen for about a year now. And certainly, if you're as old as I am, you've seen a lot of crazy in my lifetime, or a lot of troublemakers. But I do think that's really important to think about, that sometimes the troublemakers get all the attention and they get on the news and everyone talks about them and everyone's obsessed with them. But they really do make up a small fraction of the world's population. And they're a very small number compared to the people who just live their lives every day, doing the best that they can, living a good life with love and compassion and kindness. And so I think that that's a really good thing to think about. All right, so that's the Dalai Lama. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you soon.